It was supposed to be a simple night, but for Livy Lewis, it turned into a nightmare that would cost her life. When she decided to stay at a friend's house, she had no idea that Matthew Edgar, the man who once loved her, would lose control and let jealousy take over. A night full of drinking and anger quickly spiraled into a tragic murder. What followed was a desperate search for answers, a grieving family, and a mother who refused to let her daughter's death be forgotten. The truth behind that night would soon come to light, and it was more chilling than anyone could have imagined.
Where's my kid? Where's my kid? I don't care, where is she? Tell me something, where is she? Where's Livy?
It was a blur, but all she could think of was whether her daughter was alive or dead. Livy Lewis, a bright, kind-hearted young woman, had always been a loving soul. She had dreams of becoming a nurse, always putting others before herself. But that morning, no one could tell her whether her daughter was alive or dead. The scene was grim. Livy's body had been found slumped over the steering wheel of her car, dead from a rifle wound to the neck. For her family, the pain was unbearable. I just needed to know, is she alive or is she dead? Her mother cried. Livy had just turned 19, a recent high school graduate with everything to live for. She was a straight A student, on track to become a nurse, and a certified nursing assistant. She was loved by everyone around her, especially the residents she cared for at the nursing home. Livy's mother had no idea what to think when the news reached her. It was Halloween morning, a time of year when the line between the living and the dead is blurred, but nothing could have prepared her for the news that her daughter had been shot. The call came from a friend who had heard the terrible news. "Isn't that Darcy Bass's daughter?" they asked. Her world collapsed as the details of the tragic incident unraveled. It all took place in the small town of Hemphill, Texas, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets don't stay hidden for long. The community was shaken to its core, and the name Livy Lewis was on everyone's lips. She had been a remarkable young woman, admired by her friends and peers. Livy was a caring, selfless soul who loved helping others. That's why she decided to pursue a career in nursing, a field where she could continue her passion for taking care of people. She worked alongside her best friend, Taylor Barnett, a fellow nursing assistant who was over 6 years older than Livy, but shared a strong bond with her. Livy and Taylor became inseparable, and Taylor's young daughter quickly formed a special connection with Livy too. Bailey Williams, who had known Livy since kindergarten, recalled how Livy had always been a more mature soul. She didn't enjoy the typical childish games, preferring stability and maturity. Maybe that's why Livy had been drawn to Matthew Edgar, an older man who was 23 when they met. Livy had initially met Matthew through mutual friends, and their secret relationship began when she was still in high school. But Matthew was married to Montana Bokel, with whom he had 2 young sons. Text records between Livy and Matthew revealed their secret affair, starting in November 2019. When Matthew texted, "You realize you can't tell anyone we're texting, right?" Livy responded with a knowing laugh. "Well, obviously I'm not going to brag about texting a married man." Despite the brief affair, Livy ended things quickly. But Matthew wasn't ready to let go. Months later, he reached out again, complaining about his unhappy marriage. "I cheated again," he admitted, but Livy stood firm, writing, "I'm not really down for being a homewrecker." Eventually, Matthew ended his marriage, and soon after, Livy found herself navigating a complicated relationship with a man who had 2 young sons and an ex-wife. At first, Livy and Montana didn't get along. Montana was jealous of Livy, but the relationship eventually shifted, and Montana started to see Livy as a friend. They began talking regularly, though it was clear that Montana still harbored some resentment. Amid all the turmoil, Livy tried to keep her life on track, but no one could have foreseen the tragic turn it would take. On that fateful Halloween morning, Livy was found dead in her car. The investigation would uncover more than just a simple crime. It would reveal a tangled web of relationships, lies, and unresolved issues. As the mystery surrounding Livy's death unraveled, the truth was far more chilling than anyone had anticipated. Who was responsible for her death, and why? These were the questions that haunted the small town, and they would continue to linger long after the investigation began. What happened that night was a tragic end to a promising young life, and the story of Livy Lewis would leave an indelible mark on all who knew her. Livy's eyes told a story, one of confusion, maybe even hope. But in Montana's eyes, there was something darker. I think she was jealous, someone close to the investigation suggested. Some people get close to others for reasons they don't make clear, and I think that's what happened here. A dangerous love triangle had formed. It was a triangle that no one saw coming. As the investigation unfolded, Sabine County Sheriff's investigator J.P. McDonough probed Matthew about his complicated relationships with both Montana and Livy. "What's your relationship like with them?" McDonough asked. Matthew's response was casual, almost dismissive. "It's awesome," he said. "It's not what you think. My ex-wife and Livy, they're big buddies." He admitted to warning Livy to keep her distance from Montana, advising her to be civil for the sake of the children, but not too close. "She's my ex-wife," he reminded her. But over time, it became clear that Matthew's behavior was growing more disturbing. Taylor Barnett, Livy's close friend and confidante, noticed the change. "He was pretty much abusive in more ways than one," she recalled. "He'd get drunk, get crazy, and yell at Livy. It got so bad that I didn't want him around anymore." Text messages revealed a relationship full of turmoil, with Matthew alternately sending sweet texts to Livy, like "Good night, baby, I love you," while Livy's messages revealed a different reality. "I don't know why you keep putting your hands on me like that, my body hurts today." She knew something wasn't right, but she stayed, holding on to the belief that maybe Matthew could change. Livy had plans to move to college in the fall of 2020, but those plans shifted. Instead, she agreed to move in with Matthew and help care for his 2 sons. She even redecorated their rooms, turning them into sports-themed havens, one for baseball, one for football, and one for soccer. But by August 2020, things had spiraled out of control. Livy wrote to Matthew, pouring her heart out, "I want to be in our home with you, but I can't do it the way you act when you drink. I'm scared of you. You've laid your hands on me multiple times. I deserve better than this." Had she confided this to anyone else? "No, she didn't tell me," Matthew's mother, Cindy, explained. "She probably didn't want me to do something crazy." But Livy had shared her distress with her cousin, Sydney Ebar, even sending a disturbing photo of her injuries, a busted nose. The abuse was a cruel reality for Livy, and it was even worse when Matthew admitted to cheating on her. On October 4th, 2020, Livy's birthday, Matthew texted his ex-wife, Montana, boasting, "I didn't cheat on Livy with multiple women, just you, LOL." At the heart of it all, Livy was trapped, manipulated by Matthew and his ex-wife, Montana. She was caught in a web of deceit and emotional abuse, unaware that the storm was about to get much worse. By Halloween morning, Matthew and Livy would cross paths again, but not in the way anyone expected. Matthew was found in a hospital bed, blood on his face, with no memory of how he got there. He claimed he'd been drinking, admitting to consuming a bottle of Jim Beam and a few beers earlier that day. He had been at a party at his friend Bobby Ozan's house the night before, and said that was the last time he'd seen Livy. But after that, Matthew couldn't explain how he ended up lying unconscious on the ground between 2 vehicles, one of which was Livy's. Sheriff's investigator J.P. McDonough questioned him thoroughly. "You don't know how you ended up behind the car with the dead girl?" he asked. Matthew's response was vague, "I have no clue." McDonough took samples of the blood on Matthew's face for DNA testing, and soon after, Matthew was arrested, charged with homicide. Matthew didn't react the way most would when confronted with such a serious accusation. He didn't show fear or anger. Instead, he remained silent, offering no defense. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, but there was no emotion in his voice. His arrest was just the beginning of the investigation, and the clock was ticking. In Texas, the district attorney's office had 90 days to present enough evidence to the grand jury to charge him, or Matthew would be released on bond. Meanwhile, McDonald enlisted the help of the Texas Rangers to dig deeper. Matthew was not an easy suspect. A former colleague, Sean Dunn, knew him well and believed Matthew when he said he had no memory of what had happened. Sean had spent a lot of time with Matthew and saw him as a hard-working, family-oriented man. "When you've worked in law enforcement and you've sat across from a killer, you can tell," Sean said. "But I never got that feeling from Matthew. I think he genuinely didn't know what happened that night." As the investigation deepened, questions lingered. If Matthew didn't kill Livy, then who did? There were other people who could have been involved. Matthew and his mother, Kendi, both hinted that Montana might have played a role in Livy's death. In a jailhouse call, Matthew was heard talking to his mother, saying, "If it turns out Montana did this, I don't want to talk about it." The bond between Montana and Livy had always been a topic of suspicion. What started as a friendship between ex-wife and ex-girlfriend seemed to evolve into something more complex, and for McDonald it raised red flags. "My husband left me for this woman, but she's my best friend," Montana had said, a comment that made McDonald question the whole dynamic. One of the last photos of Livy shows her with Montana, taken at the party Matthew had mentioned. There were around 20 people at Bobby Ozan's house, but Matthew, feeling isolated, had stayed in the background. Investigators learned that Livy had broken up with him just weeks before her death, and Matthew had started a new relationship with another woman in town. It was clear that the web of relationships, deceit, and violence surrounding Livy's death was far from simple, and as the investigation continued, the truth seemed more elusive than ever. Matthew Edgar's life seemed to have been overshadowed by jealousy and anger, emotions that intensified the night Livy Lewis decided to stay at Bobby Ozan's house. For weeks, Matthew had been nursing a broken heart, still unable to let go of Livy, despite their separation. Bobby, a mutual friend, watched as Matthew, more intoxicated by the hour, simmered with frustration. The party at Bobby's house was winding down, but Matthew wasn't ready to leave. He was drinking heavily, stewing with rage, and unable to move past the woman he still wanted. Then Livy made the decision that would unravel everything. She chose to stay the night at Bobby's. That simple decision sent Matthew into a fit of fury. Montana Bokel, his ex-wife, recalls how Matthew returned to Bobby's house unexpectedly, his temper flaring. She remembers how Matthew kicked in doors and punched windows, his anger spilling over into violence. Montana had to leave with the girls, fearing for their safety, and headed to Matthew's mother's house. But Matthew wouldn't stop there. His rage followed her, and as she tried to escape to safety, Matthew's destructive path continued. The texts Matthew sent that night painted a chilling picture. He threatened Montana, accusing her of playing a role in Livy's decision to stay with Bobby. His wrath reached a dangerous peak when he declared that he would take their lives. But even though his threats were chilling, Montana didn't call 911, not thinking Matthew was capable of following through. What she didn't know was that Matthew had already begun carrying out his deadly plan. Around 3 a.m., Matthew sent a final text to Montana, "I'm leaving, better get here and get your kids." The next thing she knew, Matthew was back at his house. The chilling text, "I got Livy's keys and her phone," sent a shockwave through Montana's system, but it didn't seem real at the time. Matthew's words, "she's dead," were met with disbelief. Montana thought he was just angry, irrational, but the truth would soon prove otherwise. The horrifying evidence slowly started to unfold. Matthew's fingerprints on Livy's things, his presence at the crime scene, and the damning texts he had sent. It all pointed to one brutal conclusion. Matthew had killed Livy. Montana's decision to remain silent would haunt her for months, even as investigators and the community wrestled with the tragic reality of what had happened. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Matthew's mother tried to distract investigators with a wild theory about a drug cartel, but that quickly unraveled as law enforcement continued their pursuit of the truth. The case would go through delays, and the courtroom drama only heightened as the pandemic delayed hearings and trials. Finally, in 2021, after Matthew had been released on a low bond, he disappeared, vanishing from his home, leaving his ankle monitor behind. He was on the run, and the community was terrified. For days, months, the authorities, and especially Darcy, Livy's grieving mother, would search tirelessly. Matthew remained a fugitive, taunting his family and the authorities. When Matthew's whereabouts were finally confirmed, it was in a house just yards from his grandparents' property. A covert operation by law enforcement brought the manhunt to a close. Matthew was cornered, caught, and found in a house with his mother, who seemed almost surprised at his capture. But the chase wasn't over yet. Matthew's fate would soon be sealed. In 2022, Matthew's trial began. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA linking him to the crime scene, the murder weapon traced back to him, and those fateful texts where he confessed to killing Livy. Yet his defense attorney tried to downplay the DNA evidence, even suggesting other possible suspects. But no one was buying it. Matthew had no defense against the damning evidence, and after a brief deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Despite the verdict, Matthew was still on the run. His escape sent shockwaves through the community, and his mother was charged with aiding in his evasion. The search continued until Matthew was finally apprehended in 2022. He was brought back to face the consequences of his actions, sentenced to 99 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. It was a bittersweet moment for Darcy. The sentencing didn't bring back Livy, but it was a step toward justice. Darcy, though, has no peace. Every day is a struggle as she clings to the memory of her daughter. She works to ensure Livy's memory is more than just the victim of a tragedy. Darcy hopes that when Matthew comes up for parole, she will be there to remind him that Livy is gone, and he is the one who took her life. Though Livy is gone, her family has made it their mission to remember her for the person she was, not the way she died. And for Darcy, the fight isn't over. Not in court, not in her heart. She'll keep fighting for Livy's memory and the justice she deserves.